Welcome back, motorized bike enthusiast. Today we'll be repairing for the first time in 4 years the Seeutek PK80, and then we're going to discuss camera tips to help your videos go from looking and sounding like this to looking and sounding like this. Then we'll be heading on over to the comment section to answer some viewer questions. I would consider myself to be pretty lucky with these bikes so far, as up to now I have never been left stranded and walking home a great distance away from the house. But for the first time in 4 years, I finally had a breakdown that left me walking home. The Seeutek PK80, in my opinion, is a great little motor. Compared to the other China dolls I've had, it runs a lot smoother and is quite peppy. It's not quite as strong as the Seeutek 4040 and obviously nowhere near the YD100, but for the price, being about the same as other motors, it's done great. It's a relatively quiet motor too. That might just have to do with the type of exhaust it has and lack of porting, but it's still quieter than my other motors. Unlike with my trail bikes, I've never gone out of my way to abuse this motor. Not that I attempt to abuse my other motors, but I certainly haven't put it through any situations that the trail bikes have seen. However, my learning curve was done on this motor, being the first motor I ever purchased on the first bike I ever built, and then swapped over to another bike along the way. The first signs of an engine issue occurred when I was going to work a few weeks ago. I had issues with the idle, the bike would sometimes stall out when I'd come to a stop, and I noticed that there was a slight lack of power. However, at the time, I kind of just overlooked this simply because I was so used to riding the YD100 trail bike that I thought that I had just become spoiled by the other motor, and this is how the engine always ran. But going back and looking at some of my older videos and the pitch and sound of the motor along with the acceleration, that's when I started to realize that something was going wrong with the motor. The first thing I suspected to be an issue was something to do with the electrical system, the ignition system, as we had been tinkering around with it in the past to try and get a charging system to work, so there's no telling what issues or damage I might have caused along the way. Starting with the usual suspects, we pulled the plug, turned over the motor, and had a good strong spark. The plug was also wet with fresh fuel. I cleaned the carburetor anyways, but it turns out the motor was getting spark and fuel. So there's two other possibilities that I could think of. One, which is uncommon and I've never actually heard of this happening, but possible, that the magnet was out of position. Possibly came loose when we were tinkering around with it and simply threw the ignition system out of time. This was not the case, so that left us with one other option: a lack of compression. A coincidental situation left me with an incorrect assumption. This was the first tank I'd ever run 40-to-1 semi-synthetic. For years I've run this engine on 32-to-1 conventional. Due to this, however unlikely, I thought I possibly destroyed the cylinder and or piston. So, just in case, before I went ahead and did any work to the engine because I was lacking on time, I decided to go ahead and order a cylinder and piston kit from Amazon for about 30 bucks. After pulling the head and cylinder and expecting the worst, it turns out that the cylinder and the piston, as far as I could tell, were in pretty good condition. The cylinder looked great. The piston looked like it might have some hot spots, but it didn't look like it was going to fail anytime soon. So at this point I thought maybe it was a blown gasket, and my worst fear is that it might be a blown main seal, as I'd never completely cracked a case apart and I wasn't looking forward to doing it. So before I decided to go ahead and start replacing gaskets, I first went back to the spark plug, thinking that maybe there was a compression loss in the plug, on the threads, at the washer, or the internal components itself. You never know. This is the original plug that came with this motor. So after checking to make sure we had spark on a brand new China plug, we went ahead, threw it in the motor, and voila, it fired right up. I thought, aha, that was it. It was just a bad plug. But the motor wasn't running right. It was still running like it had been running when I'd taken it to work before it failed. It wouldn't really accelerate very fast, and once it got to max throttle, it didn't have much power, and it four-stroked quite a bit, with a lot of excess smoke coming out of the exhaust. Now there's a number of things which cause a motor to four-stroke and give you excess smoke from the exhaust, but I was still certain we had a compression loss granted everything we had just gone through on the motor. So I decided to go ahead and pull the head back off to check and see if this gasket was sealing. I've had issues with these cheap aluminum gaskets not sealing in the past and just assumed that might be the issue. And after pulling the head back off, that did appear to be the issue, as the exhaust and intake side did not seem to be sealing at all. But this was strange because it's weird to have two sides not seal up like this. I torqued down the head, same as with all my other bike, and an X-cross pattern with the proper torque being about 12 foot-pounds. Anyways, I didn't think much of it at the time, so I just went ahead and put another gasket on to see if this solved the problem. And then this happened. Now, I'm really not sure if this was a flaw in the motor that just slowly creeped up over time, or if at some point in the past, when I was still learning, I mistorqued the head, which is definitely possible. These are cheap, small aluminum heads. Anyways, apparently there's a crack in the head, and it's running all the way to the spark plug. So who knows what caused it, but that's definitely the issue. Now, at this point I was debating on whether or not to go ahead and just replace the entire cylinder, piston, and head, but because the cylinder and the piston look so darn good and I didn't want to have to go through the whole break-in process again, plus it's a lot of work, removing those gaskets was not fun or easy, I decided to go ahead and just take a head off of an old blown motor, put it on here, and see if that would work. And that brings us to where we are now. Currently, the motor is running just fine. It's not smoking excessively, and it's not four-stroking at max throttle. I still feel like the acceleration and top speed is low. I remember this motor being a bit more peppy than it is now. I could just be spoiled from the YD100, but I'll keep you guys posted. If the motor has any more issues, I'm just going to go ahead and replace the entire head, cylinder, and piston with all new hardware. A lack of understanding of basic camera gear and recording techniques has given me the best compliment I've received on my channel in a long time. This certain individual thought that I sped up my videos to make me look like an excellent rider. Well, I'm flattered, but I assure you I don't speed up my videos. In this section, I'm going to give you guys a few of my techniques that I use to make the videos sound and look better. They're simply more enjoyable to watch, but a side product of this is it will make you look like you're going faster, even if that's not your intention. We did touch on a few of these tips in a recent video, but that had more to do with lighting and scenery. This goes more in depth. And although most of these tips will improve your videos regardless of the camera you're using, one of them in particular is camera specific. The first tip, and honestly what I feel is the most important, is where you choose to film your rides. See, if you're on a long, stretched out wide street with not a lot of detail and large objects such as cars and buildings that you pass, it's not going to look like you're going very fast. Obviously this has its limits. Guys with 60-mile-an-hour bikes are going to look fast regardless, but a stock bike would just look a lot more entertaining to watch if you can find a path that's narrow with a lot of detail. Objects that you pass in close proximity. Gravel paths, side streets that are kind of rough with cracks in them, anything that's narrow where you'll pass by objects quickly such as shrubs, trees, bushes, grass. These make it look like you're going faster, and they're just more entertaining to watch because of the detail in the environment. The second most important tip I have is camera placement. Out of all the places I've experimented with mounting a camera on the bike and on my body, the chest mount is the best for audio and video. Mounting a camera to the bike for a point of view reference is great, but never mount a camera to the handlebars. There is no camera I've seen so far that has image stabilization that can handle the ridiculous vibration from the handlebars. Seeing things like the motor on a solid mount of the frame is fine, the back of the bike for the rear sprocket's cool, but the handlebars, don't do it. Every time I see it, I cringe. Now, mounting a camera to your helmet is fine if you want to be able to turn the camera to look at certain objects, or you just want to record the trip but you're not too interested in a perception of speed, or you don't worry about wind noise. That's great, but I don't recommend it as a main camera. Mounting the camera to your helmet has two main drawbacks. First, wind noise is ridiculous. The camera is completely exposed and has nothing to block it from the wind. And getting the camera higher in the air just makes it look like you're going slower. Think of it like a jet. If you're flying way up in the air, the ground looks like it doesn't move all that fast, but if your jet's flying 100 feet off the ground, it's going to look ridiculous. Mounting the camera to your chest brings it lower to the ground, which increases your perception of speed. It's also a lot more entertaining to watch parts of the bike, like the handlebars, the throttle, just as your body moves over obstacles. It's more entertaining for a lot of the bike guys to watch than a helmet camera. Also, wind noise. Believe it or not, the body act is a great natural barrier to the wind. You might think that being on your chest, getting hit directly by the wind would cause a lot of wind noise, but it doesn't work that way. Because of the way the aerodynamics have to move around your body, it creates kind of a dead zone right in front of your camera. As you can hear in these clips, when I have one mounted to my head, it doesn't look fast, and the wind noise is pretty ridiculous. But when I have it mounted to my chest, it's closer to the motor, and it has a buffer from the wind, so it looks faster, and it sounds better. Our third tip is camera angle, pointing the camera slightly down. This has benefits, as we mentioned in the previous video, of not blowing out the camera from the bright sky and seeing more details in the shadow, but the main benefit here is perception of speed. It has the same effect as bringing the camera lower. You point the angle slightly down, don't get too carried away. Nobody wants to watch knees all the time, but slightly down sees more of the ground passing by quickly. And our last tip is to use the widest field of view that your camera offers. If you have a GoPro, stick with Super View. It's a mode specifically designed for moving objects. But getting the widest field of view that your camera offers will let you see more off to the side. And as you see things passing you off to the side in close proximity, that's what makes you really look like you're moving. If you have a narrow field of view, you don't see as much off to the side. You only see what's off in the distance, and those objects appear to approach slowly, and then you don't really get to see them pass by. The next few clips are going to show you guys the difference that these tips make. These are two identical cameras recording at the same time. I have a helmet camera with a medium field of view and a straight angle. I have a chest camera with an extra wide field of view, or super view, with a slightly down angle. And right before we get into the comment section, I would like to give a shout out to SB Airsoft. He sent me some pictures of his recent build. It's a Huffy Naluso, I believe. It's a super clean blacked out build. I always love these blacked out looks. And the street tires on these bikes for some reason just always look really nice. He also had a pretty clever idea with his rack on putting a spare emergency toolkit on the back. Pretty clever. I like it. Just got to black out the toolkit so it matches the bike. Also, make sure you get yourself a pair of pliers in here. You might already have them. I don't see them, but pliers are a must. In an attempt to not butcher his name, I'm going to call him Mr. Almora, and he has a great question with some good details which help us answer this a little better than most of these when I get them. He wants to know if he should go with an electric or a gas motor for his situation, and unfortunately, because of the details he's provided, I don't think either one of them are a good option. But if you have to choose between one or the other, I'll try and give you as much information as I can to hopefully help you out. I'm going to put 3 motors in this category: the hub-mounted electrics, the 2-strokes, and the 4-strokes. Let's get over some pros and cons. With electric, you're quieter, so if you're in close proximity to people, you're not going to upset anyone. They generally go unnoticed and are considered stealthy. The 2-strokes are not ridiculously loud as long as you stay with the stock exhaust system, but the moment you start modding it, you're going to get loud, and you're going to be annoying to people if you're close to them. But as far as I know, in California, the laws generally favor motorized bikes. So even if you are a little noisy, at least you know you're not illegal. The 4-strokes are a good balance between the two. From what I've heard, they're quieter than the 2-strokes. Reliability. I'm going to have to go with electric on this one, hands down. The electric motors, from everything I've seen, are simply more reliable. And because there are so many options when it comes to quality, depending on your budget, you can really up the reliability on the electric motors. There's fewer moving parts, less to go wrong. Safety. This is going to go to the electric too. If you're going with a hub-mounted setup especially, the safety of the electric setups are just bar none better. There's less to go wrong. There's no chain to break. There's nothing to get caught in the spokes. There's fewer things to come loose and vibrate. All in all, electric is just going to be safer. The safety of 2 and 4-strokes is going to be about the same. Both vibrate, both have extra parts that can go wrong. Maintenance. Once again to the electric. With the exception of the battery needed to be tended to every once in a while and not forgotten about, there's basically no maintenance to be done. As far as I've seen, the electric kits are basically just put on the bike, and as long as they're water resistant, you're good. You don't have to do anything to them ever. Maintenance between the 4 and 2-strokes is probably going to go to the 4-strokes. From what I've seen, not personal experience, but the 4-strokes seem to require less maintenance. But I would recommend going and upgrading the clutch assembly on a 4-stroke. The centrifugal clutch and the gearing, it's been known to have some failure points, but the motor itself generally doesn't require much maintenance other than an oil change every once in a while. 2-strokes, on the other hand, are just non-stop messing with stuff, tightening stuff, replacing stuff. 2-strokes, honestly, I believe are more of a hobby and a toy rather than a reliable form of transportation, something you need to depend on. That doesn't mean it can't be done. There are people who do it. I do it. But it's a big learning curve to get there. There's a lot of little tricks you need to know to get the 2-stroke kits running solid for a long time. With everything we pointed out so far, you think electric is the way to go, but unfortunately in your situation, I really don't think it is, because of the distance and the amount of traveling you would have to do non-stop. Now, if you can afford, and if you can figure out the logistics of getting a few extra packs to your work, or wherever you base out of, where they're charging while you're riding, then you could certainly get away with it. But the batteries for these things are expensive. Buying a bunch of them might not be in your budget. But if it is, then I'm going to say electric is the way to go. Now, if you can't really afford to have a bunch of extra battery packs, or the logistics of getting them to where you base out of it because of their size and weight is not practical, then I'm going to say go with a 4-stroke setup. Do a little more research to find out what parts of the 4-strokes generally need to be upgraded. But honestly, out of all the options for you and your situation, I think a 4-stroke is the way to go. You're going to have good range. You can gas it up and go whenever you get low on fuel. You can do that in a moment. They're relatively quiet compared to the 2-strokes. They won't really upset anyone. They only require a few upgrades to become reliable. And, well, that's pretty much all I got. So, buddy, I know this wasn't a straightforward answer, but you're kind of in a tough spot with how you have to use your bike. Kenny brings up an interesting observation. If you notice, on some of these head gaskets, they can appear to overhang slightly, especially after they've been squished into position. I might start using the copper gaskets because of this. It's possible that the overhanging material is what damaged the cylinder on the original Huffy build, which he might be experiencing the same issue. So good looking out. Andy has a personal recommendation to not bother using a high-end bike on one of these builds. His reasons are a little different than mine, though. He explains that the higher-end bikes might still fatigue and break in the same places as the cheap bikes. Well, I have a differing opinion on that, but mainly my idea of using a high-end bike on a motorized trail build is simply so the bike is more capable of handling the trail. As you might have seen in my last video, where we bent the forks on the cheap Walmart bike when we hit a rut a little too fast. That simply wouldn't have happened with the Path Dragon, which is a higher end build, and certainly wouldn't happen with a more expensive bike frame. He thinks he might bite the bullet and get one of the frames where the tank is built into the frame, and from what I understand is those are higher end bikes. They use better bearings and have better welds. Of course, this could all depend on who you buy it from, but generally something like the Phantom Motum frame, or the Fat Moto frame, from what I've seen and heard, is a higher end bike, and that certainly has a motor on it. While having a discussion about possibly using a GPU heatsink on the YD100 to help improve cooling, he wants to know if the idea of somehow heat-sinking the head to the frame of the bike is a stupid idea. Honestly, I don't think that's a stupid idea at all, but I don't see how it could be done practically. Ellis Demon wants to know if it's worth the extra money to get the YD100. Well, assuming that at this time, due to the pandemic, the price has not been inflated, then yes, I personally believe the YD100 is worth the extra $40 to $50. However, I am starting to think it's not really a good trail bike, at least not hardcore trail bike motor. If you're going to run a bike with a larger sprocket, I think you might want to stick with a standard PK80, but the YD100 simply needs to go faster for better air cooling, as we run into some overheating issues. Now that being said, we did just run 58 miles straight on that motor, and you can go check out last week's video if you're interested in seeing how it did. Spoiler alert, I didn't have any issues. Brian Bassett thinks that two-strokes should be outlawed since people don't care enough to stop using them willy-nilly. I assume he hates burning fossil fuels. Why Brian would come to a motorized bike channel which focuses solely on two-strokes and start complaining about two-strokes is beyond me. I don't know what he's expecting to gain here, probably just a trolley comment. However, keep in mind that my little two-stroke, which you hate so much, gets over 80 miles to the gallon, as we've proved in previous videos. So, before you start complaining about my bike and my motor, start complaining about all the vehicles you see driving around you that I guarantee do not get 80 miles to the gallon. I think electric bikes are great, and if that's the way you want to go, more power to you. But don't come here and start complaining about my motors. It's ridiculous, man. Guys, if I missed your comment, I apologize, but understand that I get a lot of comments every day. I wake up with a lot of notifications. I try to get to as many as I can, and sometimes YouTube doesn't even notify me when a new comment pops up. I'm not sure why. So I try to get to all of them, and periodically I go through to see what I've missed. If you weren't answered in the video and you haven't been answered yet, then feel free to ask your question again on a different video. Eventually YouTube will show me the notifications, I promise. Ride safe. I'll see you in the next video.